Thank you very much. I know we're running out of time, so I'll go through this very quickly. I actually want to make a point. I'm no longer with Eco Northwest. I'm with Natural Resource Economics. I was asked to talk about the importance of the timber production and Oregon's forest economy. This is a formal title that Lisa gave me, but really what this is about, what should we be doing with Oregon's forests? And in particular, most people are concerned about what can we do with our forests in order to stimulate economic growth and to create good, stable, high-wage jobs. Economists are also concerned about this bottom issue of benefits versus cost. And what that means is, what's the value of the products that you get from whatever it is you're going to do? What are the benefits compared to the costs? And that's important because we know that we have economic improvement when we take something that's worth not very much and we turn it into something that's worth an awful lot. We also know that societies can go the other direction, that they can take something valuable and turn it into something that's not very important, and that's a prescription for long-term poverty for an economy. So that's what we're talking about. So let's get started. This is what's happened with timber harvest in Oregon. Going back to 1986, you see that it started out at about 8 billion board feet per year. That's over in 1986 on the left-hand side. Let's see, does that show up? Yellow on yellow usually doesn't show up very well, I guess. But then it dropped down to about 4 billion board feet. And it dropped down to 4 billion board feet in 1994. And that was when you had a shift in the management of federal lands. So we've been going on about 4 million board feet. Now, what's been happening to those logs? Well, what we see again from 1997 to about 2009, over here on the right, we see that it's been about 400 million board feet have been exported. So that's about 1 log in 10, 400 million out of 4 billion. But more recently, it's jumped to about 1 log in 5. And the data, actually, the federal government, the Forest Service, hasn't been producing the data that they typically do, but an industry report from earlier or late last year indicated that for the West Coast as a whole, for much of 2014, it was 1 log out of 2 is being exported. Now, that's important because you can't get jobs in mills if the logs aren't going to the mills. Instead, they're going on a ship and being shipped to China. We also know that timber jobs have shrunk. A lot of people, the common wisdom is, well, they've shrunk because of the change in forest practices on federal lands, because of that, darn spotted owl. That's not the case. We've been losing timber jobs in this state for a very, very long time. And in particular, we've been losing them since about the mid-1980s, which is the green peak up there on the top, when we had about 80,000 workers in the timber industry. It's important because in the mid-1980s, the industry broke the unions. So, again, this is too dim to see. The industry broke the unions. And when they did that, you see that big drop in green in the middle of the 1980s. They've continued to eliminate jobs, and some of that is very, very understandable. You have new technology. We just heard that the mill that burned in Springfield last year employed 250 workers. They're going to rebuild it and employ 180 workers, largely because of technology. So that's what's going on. In terms of the Northwest Forest Plan, the timber part of this, the NWFP there, that accounted for only about 1/3 of the jobs lost only in the 1990s. So that's only about 3,000 jobs are attributable specifically to that change in what's happened on federal lands. The rest of it is decisions made within the corporations to reduce their employment and do other things with what they would have paid for wages. The upshot of all of this is that the timber industry is not now an engine of growth, if it ever was, in our lifetimes. We now see that this shows wood products as a percent of Oregon's GDP, or gross domestic product. GDP is a measurement of all of the output of industrial and commercial activity. And it used to be about 12% back in the 60s and the 70s. It's now down about 1% of Oregon's GDP comes from the timber industry. And the reason why there are 2 lines here is that back in the 1990s, the federal government started to, or they changed the way that they gather data. But basically what they're both showing is that we're down around 1% of all jobs, and it's declining. And it's declining because you have that harvest line originally is fairly constant, and so that industry is not growing in terms of its output, and other industries are. Well, now let's really talk about the jobs. If it can't generate more output, at least it can generate jobs. And well, we see that it doesn't generate more jobs. It's in fact shedding jobs. It has for a very long time, for decades, but at least it's a well-paying job. Well, it's not. It is not. In the 1980s, the timber industry paid a premium of about 30% more than the average job for all jobs in Oregon. So the red line in the 1980s is about 30% higher than the blue line, which is all jobs. That premium has gradually eroded so that now, in 2009, the timber industry was actually paying less than the average for the state as a whole. And I haven't been able to find subsequent data for this. So what's really happened is that since the 1980s, the industry has eliminated jobs, and it's taken money back out of workers back into the corporation. It's no longer having to pay that premium because the industry's union is no longer there to protect the workers' rights and their ability to capture those wages. But at least, we've heard the argument, at least if you have more logging, and we've had proposals to increase logging on federal lands, at least if you do that, then at least you get jobs in rural communities, and that provides stability. So that was a stability part of this. So it can't generate growth. Can it generate stability? Well, what happened with federal agencies and federal lands in the 1990s was a perfect sociological experiment, in that you had a very abrupt, very large shift in what's happening in the management of federal lands, and hence what's happening in the timber industry, and hence what's happening in communities in Oregon. So sociologists of all sorts flocked to this area to try to figure it out. And what they expected was that with the elimination of logging on federal lands, you would have all kinds of social chaos. All right? They found just the opposite. They found that in communities where you had a higher concentration of the timber industry, where you had more timber activity, you had higher unemployment. You had lower income, more poverty, lower levels of education, more abuse of children and spouses, and poor health care, more arrests. And again, I'm not saying, none of this is to say that it's bad. I'm not saying this at all. I'm here as a reporter. So, but the conclusion is from all of this, and it's a quick summary, is that can more logging stimulate economic growth? It cannot. I'm sorry, that's what that means. When you have the industry being such a small part of our economy, it is not going to stimulate very much economic growth. You know, it's a very small lever. Can it generate stable, high-wage jobs? It cannot. Well, what about benefits versus costs? Because we hear this all the time, that you have all of this timber, the forest is growing, it's adding wood up there. Let's at least do something useful with it and get the benefits out of that. Well, the last couple of years, we've seen a proposal to increase logging on the ONC lands, the BLM lands, federal lands in Western Oregon. And as part of that proposal, the timber industry, the initial proposal that came from Representatives Schrader and Representative DeFazio was to sell the land. And so the industry had to come up and say what would they pay for that land. And they would pay about $5,000 an acre for a big chunk of big chunk of land. What that tells the economist is that the benefit from logging on those lands is about $5,000 an acre. Well, back from the 1980s, 1990s, this is the green part over here, economists did all kinds of studies because, again, we had all of this chaos going on with spotted owls and the like, and we looked at, well, if you log more, you get dirtier water. That's a cost. You get less water in many places, especially in the Coast Range, because those big trees capture that fog, an awful lot of that water drops on the ground, and it's a lot. You know, it's several feet per year. And you also lose habitat of things that are really important, salmon, spotted owls, bomber bullets, and the like. That loss, if you have logging in areas where you have those sorts of concerns, is more than $20,000 an acre. So in those places you have the loss, the cost is greater than the benefit. And that's why an awful lot of economists at the time, in the early 1990s, said, stop logging on federal lands because the cost is greater than the benefit. For economists, that was it was a no-brainer at that time. But it's the line in the middle that's a killer right now. We did not talk about climate change at that point. When you log big trees especially, and we have an awful lot of big trees here. We have trees that hold more carbon than any other ecosystem in the world, except for just a few. Think about that. Especially on federal lands, we have more carbon sitting out there in the land, out of the atmosphere, than any other place. So when you cut that, about 3/4 of that carbon goes up into the atmosphere. That carbon dioxide goes up into the atmosphere and it creates more drought, it creates higher temperatures, it creates more storms, it creates wider spread of disease and insects that cost people an awful lot of money. It raises sea level, which costs an awful lot of money for people who live on the coast. There have been studies around the world that have looked at what is the value of that cost. How big is it? Last year, about 10 federal agencies put all their economists, locked them in a room, said, look at all of the studies that have been done and estimate what the value is of those costs. The term is called the social cost of carbon. And they came up with a range. If you use the very bottom of their range, where, boy, they are being super cautious, you get $8,000 per acre. Their middle level, if you use it, you get $30,000 an acre. If you use their upper number, it's $100,000 an acre. So if you go out and you cut federal lands in Western Oregon, the social cost of that could be as high as $100,000 an acre, which is a stunning number. Until Monday of this week, when there was a new study published to look at and correct one of the weaknesses, one of the major weaknesses in the economic models that underlies all of this. And it focused on that, on the estimate that underlies that $30,000, the one in the middle there. And it said the actual number is 6 times that. So our middle estimate then of the value of the carbon sitting on federal lands in Western Oregon is about $180,000 an acre. Societies that convert something very valuable into something that's not very valuable, that is a prescription for economic poverty. That's why an awful lot of economists now say, and have said for a very long time, just in terms of carbon alone, there is no way we should be thinking about cutting timber on Western Oregon federal forest lands especially. Private lands are different. They certainly are. But the same sort of argument applies. State lands are different. They certainly are. But state lands are a lot closer to federal lands than they are to private lands because they've been sitting there for quite a long time. The trees are bigger. But this is a very big issue, and it's not received very much attention in Salem. Or if it has received attention in Salem, it's been ignored. So we come back to here. Can increased logging stimulate economic growth? It cannot. Can it generate stable high-wage jobs? It cannot. And would the benefits exceed the cost? And this is a resounding absolutely no, especially for very large trees. But is there a better alternative? What can Oregon do? And we've heard this. In rural Oregon, you just simply don't have anything else that you can do. And that may be, but let's look at some alternatives that we do have. And one of the things that we really ought to pay attention to is that there are industries out there that do experience an increase in wages. This is the high-tech industry for Oregon as a whole, and real average wages have gone from about $50,000 to about $100,000 now. That's the average. So there are industries out there. We do, as a state, have an option to do that. Well, let's talk about outdoor recreation, because that's one that comes up all of the time. This is a little complicated chart here, but the top part is what do we have now? For the timber industry as a whole, we have about 25 to 30,000 jobs. That comes off of that earlier chart, the downward sloping chart. The outdoor recreation industry has about 140,000. Now, this is hiking. This is Columbia, which makes an awful lot of gear for outdoors. This is guides. This is salmon, recreation salmon and all of that. Tackle manufacturers and the like. It's also outdoor travel, because an awful lot of outdoor recreation occurs in a car or on a motorcycle or whatnot. Okay? Or about a little less than 1/10 of all the jobs in Oregon are somehow associated with outdoor recreation. But what about new jobs? Well, last year, Senator Wyden had a bill that would have increased logging on about 1 million acres of federal lands. Now, by comparison, the private timberlands in the state are about 10 million acres. So it basically would have expanded industrial logging by about 10%. The number of jobs that it would have created is 1,600. And that's at the beginning. That downward job, that would have continued to apply, so we would have started at about 1,600 and gone down. By contrast, from 2007 through 2005 through 2012, during the recession, the outdoor recreation industry has continued to grow. You take the numbers that are there, it represents about 7,000 new jobs a year during that period. Oregon as a whole is generating about 4,000 a month, just as a comparison. So this is a potential engine of growth if we have the wisdom to pay attention to it, or if it makes sense to us. Well, why should it make sense? This map is one of the most powerful economic maps you're ever going to see, because this shows how people move. And what it shows is that people move, down on the left it says net migration, so it's for each county, the number of people moving in minus the number of people moving out. If it's blue, more people moved in than moved out. If it's red, it's the reverse. Not surprisingly, an awful lot of people left Nebraska and the like. Not surprisingly, an awful lot of people came to Oregon. Well, why is that important? That is important because we know, looking at differences in job growth across the United States, why do some states have more job growth, faster job growth than other states? There are two reasons for this, generally. One is you do something industrial, you create a new mill, or you cut trees down. The other way, well, if you do that, then you have industrial activity and people move. The other is you do the reverse. You attract people and then jobs come. Those are about equal. So this, which is attracted to industrial or to amenity-driven growth and to outdoor recreation and to high-tech jobs, attracting people is about half of the story for how we can generate economic growth and jobs in Oregon. If we mess this up, we lose half of that. That's why it's important. Now, very quickly, because Lisa's going to kick me. The next thing we can do is we can fix the revenue system. This is average property tax per real market value, and it's $12.34 per thousand. That's the average for the state. But what was driving an awful lot of the discussion pushing for new logging on federal lands is Curry County, which pays only $7.43, and Jackson County, or Josephine County, which pays $8.16. And they say, well, we don't have any sheriffs, so let's cut down the trees. Well, and every time that I've given this presentation in the dark red, dark orange counties, people say, are you kidding me? Why don't those people just pay the taxes? It's not that simple. But if we fix this issue, we would get rid of an awful lot of the pressure for cutting trees. And this is another thing we can do. We can reestablish a timber harvest tax. Before 1993, Washington, Oregon, California had timber harvest taxes that are pretty much the same. The industry persuaded Oregon to get rid of its timber harvest tax. So all we have now is the purple at the bottom. It's about $10 million a year, which the industry pays to itself. It doesn't go to counties at all. If you were in Washington, which are the green lines, and especially the dotted line, which is money that comes from a timber harvest tax that is dedicated to counties, you get about $40 million. That is money the industry has taken out of counties. That's money industry has taken away from people in those counties. Now, by comparison, I talked about the wages, the wage increment, the wage premium that's been lost. That's about $350 million that's been taken per year that the corporations have taken away from workers. And what all of this contributes to is something you're going to hear an awful lot about in the next couple of years, and that's income inequality, where more of the money is going to the very rich. This is what's happened to workers in 1990, and where were they? Were they in the lowest 20%, second lowest, or in the top 1%? And what's happened to their income since 1990? Every one of us in this room, unless you're on that far right-hand side, has experienced a reduction in your income. The timber industry has contributed to that by taking money away from workers, by taking money away from taxes, so that other people have to have fewer resources in which to generate economic activity. So thank you very much.